Arrogant lawyer mocks single mother in court. Judge stops cold when she revealed secret evidence. Emily Carter's hands trembled as she straightened her thrift store blazer, trying to steady her nerves in the imposing marble hallway of the courthouse. The echo of her worn heels against the floor seemed to mock her with each step, a constant reminder that she didn't belong in this world of power suits and leather briefcases. But she had no choice. Today, she would face the man who had destroyed her career and threatened to take what little she had left. Through the heavy wooden doors, the courtroom looked more like a theater stage, with all eyes focused on her as she made her way to the defendant's table. Her lawyer, a public defender who looked fresh out of law school, offered a weak smile that did little to calm her racing heart. On the opposite side sat Gerald Whitman, CEO of Whitman Industries, in his perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His presence commanded attention, but it was his lawyer, Vincent Hayes, whose predatory gaze made Emily's stomach turn. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michaels," the bailiff announced, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. As everyone settled back into their seats, Vincent Hayes rose with the fluid grace of a man who had performed this dance countless times before. His silver hair and expensive watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity, "we stand before you today with irrefutable evidence that Ms. Emily Carter, while employed as an executive assistant at Whitman Industries, committed a grievous breach of trust. She not only stole valuable company secrets but sold them to our direct competitors, causing damages in excess of millions of dollars." Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. The lies felt like physical blows, each one threatening to knock the air from her lungs. She watched as Hayes pulled out document after document, weaving a story that painted her as a calculating thief rather than the dedicated employee she'd been for 5 years. "Ms. Carter," Hayes continued, turning to face her with a smile that never reached his eyes, "would you care to explain these email exchanges between you and TechVision Corp.?" He held up a stack of papers, and Emily's blood ran cold. She knew those emails were fabricated, but they looked so real, so convincing. "Those aren't mine," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended. "I never sent those emails." Hayes's laugh was subtle but cutting. "Of course you didn't." His sarcasm drew quiet chuckles from the gallery. "Just like you never accessed the confidential server at 2 a.m. on March 15th? Or never met with James Phillips from TechVision at the Riverside Cafe?" Emily's public defender stood up, his chair scraping awkwardly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is leading the witness." "Sustained," Judge Michaels replied, but the damage was already done. Emily could see the doubt creeping into the judge's expression. Hayes paced the courtroom like a showman, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. "Let's talk about your financial situation, Ms. Carter. Single mother, struggling to pay rent, drowning in debt from your daughter's medical bills. Quite a desperate position, wouldn't you say?" Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation. Yes, she had struggled after her daughter's leukemia diagnosis. Yes, she had taken extra shifts and borrowed money. But she had never, would never, betray her employer's trust. "My financial situation has nothing to do with these false accusations," she responded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I worked at Whitman Industries for 5 years, gave everything to that company." "Everything including their trade secrets?" Hayes interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness, Mr. Robert Jenkins, a former colleague of Ms. Carter." Emily's heart sank as Robert approached the stand. She remembered him as a friendly face in the IT department, someone who had always helped her with computer issues. Now he wouldn't meet her eyes as he was sworn in. "Mr. Jenkins," Hayes began, "could you tell the court what you observed on the night of March 15th? Robert cleared his throat. "I saw Ms. Carter in the office late that night. She was accessing files from Mr. Whitman's private server. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was preparing documents for a morning meeting. But I knew there wasn't any meeting scheduled." Emily wanted to scream. She had been there late that night, working on a surprise presentation for the company's anniversary celebration, something Gerald himself had asked her to prepare. But now, watching Gerald's smug expression and Hayes' theatrical performance, she realized with crushing clarity that she had walked right into their trap. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Hayes said, turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, we have numerous other witnesses who will corroborate this testimony. Ms. Carter's desperate attempt to profit from her employer's intellectual property is not only a violation of her contract but a criminal act that demands severe consequences." As Hayes returned to his seat, he passed close to Emily's table. She caught a whiff of his expensive cologne and heard him mutter under his breath, "You should have known your place." Emily looked around the courtroom, at the faces showing varying degrees of judgment and disdain, at Gerald Whitman's confident smirk, at her own lawyer's uncertain expression. Everything she had worked for, every sacrifice she had made for her daughter, was being twisted into evidence of her supposed desperation and guilt. But as Hayes continued his character assassination, presenting more doctored evidence, and watching her squirm with obvious satisfaction, something shifted inside Emily. Beneath the fear and humiliation, a spark of anger began to burn. They thought they had her cornered, these powerful men with their expensive suits and practiced lies. They thought she would break under the weight of their accusations. What they didn't know was that Emily Carter had spent her entire life being underestimated. And she had one card left to play, one piece of evidence that would turn their carefully constructed case into ashes. But for now, she had to wait, had to endure Hayes' mockery and the judge's increasingly skeptical glances. Her time would come, and when it did, the arrogant smile would be wiped from Vincent Hayes' face forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as Vincent Hayes orchestrated his devastating parade of evidence. Each new exhibit felt like another nail in Emily's coffin, meticulously hammered in by Gerald Whitman's legal team with precision and cruel efficiency. "Exhibit C, Your Honor," Hayes announced, projecting a series of spreadsheets onto the courtroom's display screen. "These documents show unusual access patterns to our client's secure servers, all traced back to Ms. Carter's workstation. Notice the timestamps, all during off hours when she thought no one would be monitoring." Emily's heart raced as she recognized the spreadsheets. They were altered versions of her legitimate work on the company's anniversary presentation, but the timestamps had been changed, and entire columns of data had been manipulated to show unauthorized downloads of proprietary information. Furthermore, Hayes continued, producing a thick folder. "We have bank statements showing a series of suspicious deposits to an offshore account linked to Ms. Carter. $5,000 on March 18th, $12,000 on March 25th, and $20,000 on April 2nd, all coinciding with dates when our competitor, TechVision, announced surprising advances in their technology." Emily's public defender jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor! We've never seen these bank statements before. This is the first time they're being presented. Your Honor, we only recently uncovered this evidence through our ongoing investigation," Hayes smoothly interjected. "We've submitted all proper documentation for late evidence inclusion." Judge Michaels nodded. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Hayes." Emily felt sick to her stomach. She had never seen those bank statements before because they didn't exist, at least not until Gerald's team fabricated them. Her actual bank account barely maintained a 3-digit balance most months, stretched thin between rent, groceries, and her daughter's medical bills. The courtroom doors opened quietly, and Emily turned to see Sarah Martinez, her former cubicle mate, being escorted in by the bailiff. Sarah had been Emily's closest friend at Whitman Industries, sharing lunch breaks and offering support during the worst of her daughter's illness. But now, Sarah wouldn't meet her eyes. "Ms. Martinez," Hayes began after she was sworn in, "could you tell the court about your conversations with Ms. Carter regarding the company's new quantum computing initiative?" Sarah's hands fidgeted with her sleeve. "Emily asked me a lot of questions about the project. At first, I thought she was just being friendly, showing interest in my work. But then I noticed her taking notes during our conversations, and sometimes she'd stay late, asking to see specific technical documents." "Objection!" Emily's defender called out. "Hearsay." "Overruled," Judge Michaels replied. "The witness is recounting direct observations." Hayes smiled, like a cat playing with its prey. And did Ms. Carter ever mention her financial difficulties during these conversations? She talked about her daughter's medical bills, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she was desperate, that she needed to find a way to make more money fast. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She had confided in Sarah during her darkest moments, sharing her fears about making ends meet. Now those private conversations were being twisted into evidence of motive. "Your Honor," Hayes announced, "I'd like to present Exhibit D, security footage from the company parking lot." The grainy video showed Emily leaving the office at 11:43 p.m., carrying a laptop bag. Hayes froze the frame, zooming in on the bag. "Notice how full this bag appears, compared to this footage from her arrival that morning." He split the screen, showing a markedly slimmer bag from earlier that day. What the video didn't show was that the bag contained her daughter's medical paperwork, which she'd brought to fill out during her lunch break. But in the context Hayes was creating, it looked damning. The evidence continued to mount. Hayes presented altered keycard logs, manipulated email timestamps, and a series of witness statements from employees who had been carefully coached to reinterpret innocent interactions as suspicious behavior. "And now, Your Honor," Hayes declared, reaching into his briefcase. "The smoking gun." He pulled out a sealed envelope and approached the bench. "This document, authenticated by 3 independent experts, is a contract between Ms. Carter and TechVision Corporation, outlining the terms of her information delivery and payment schedule." Emily's defender scrambled to examine the document. "Your Honor, this is completely fabricated. My client has never seen this contract before." "Really?" Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps she'd like to explain how her signature appeared on it." "We have video footage from TechVision's lobby showing Ms. Carter entering their building on the date this contract was signed." Emily stared at the contract in horror. The signature looked exactly like hers, every loop and curve perfectly mimicked. She remembered that day at TechVision. She had gone there for a job interview after hearing rumors of upcoming layoffs at Whitman Industries. But she had never signed anything beyond a standard visitor log. Judge Michael studied the contract carefully, holding it up to the light. "The signature appears authentic, Counselor. And the video evidence corroborates the timeline." Emily watched as skepticism deepened in the judge's eyes. Even her own lawyers seemed to be losing faith, his objections becoming less frequent and more uncertain. The weight of the fabricated evidence was overwhelming, each piece fitting perfectly into the narrative Hayes had constructed. As Hayes returned to his seat, she caught Gerald Whitman's satisfied smirk. He had orchestrated this entire character assassination with meticulous precision, using his wealth and influence to create an airtight case against her. The altered documents, the coached witnesses, the fabricated contract, it was a masterpiece of deception. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Emily felt the weight of the truth in her pocket. She had one piece of evidence they didn't know about, one card left to play. For now, though, she had to endure this onslaught, had to watch as her reputation was shredded and her integrity questioned. Her time would come, but first, she had to let them think they'd won. The afternoon had stretched into early evening, and the weight of the day's proceedings hung heavy in the courtroom air. Vincent Hayes stood for his final cross-examination, adjusting his gold cufflinks as he approached Emily with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice carrying a theatrical note of false sympathy. "Let's talk about your daughter's medical condition. Leukemia treatment is expensive, isn't it?" Emily's throat tightened. "Leave my daughter out of this." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Hayes replied, his smile widening. "Your daughter's illness is central to establishing motive. The desperate needs of a single mother, drowning in medical debt." He paused for effect, pacing before the jury. "Tell me, how much does each round of chemotherapy cost?" "Objection!" Emily's defender called out. "Relevance?" "Goes to motive, Your Honor," Hayes responded smoothly. "The defendant's financial desperation is key to understanding her actions." Judge Michaels nodded. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Emily's hands clenched in her lap. $30,000 per round. $30,000, Hayes repeated, letting the number hang in the air. And your salary at Whitman Industries was what? $45,000 annually? He didn't wait for her response. Must have been impossible to keep up with those bills. Unless, of course, you found another source of income. I never stole anything, Emily insisted, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. I would never. Oh, please, Hayes interrupted, his facade of sympathy cracking to reveal the contempt beneath. Save the righteous indignation, Ms. Carter. We all understand. A sick child mounting bills, a chance to make some quick money. He turned to address the gallery. It's almost understandable, isn't it? Almost sympathetic. Except for one thing, you betrayed the trust of a man who gave you an opportunity when no one else would. Emily watched as several jurors nodded slightly, buying into Hayes's narrative. Her public defender seemed to shrink in his seat, overwhelmed by Hayes's theatrical performance. Mr. Whitman hired you despite your lack of qualifications, Hayes continued, his voice rising. He accommodated your schedule when your daughter was sick. He even authorized advances on your salary. And how did you repay his generosity? By selling his company's secrets to the highest bidder. That's not true. Emily's voice cracked with emotion. Hayes's laugh was cold and dismissive. Really? Then perhaps you'd like to explain this? He projected a new document onto the screen, a series of text messages supposedly between Emily and a TechVision executive. These messages were recovered from your company phone. Shall I read them aloud? Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. The messages were completely fabricated, but they looked authentic, complete with timestamps and her phone number. Everything you asked for is ready. Hayes read, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Transfer the money first, then I'll send the files. Your words, Ms. Carter. Written just 2 days before our proprietary algorithms appeared in TechVision's new software. The courtroom had grown so quiet that Emily could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. She could feel every eye on her, could sense the judgment and condemnation in their stares. You're not even a very good thief, Hayes continued, his mockery becoming more overt. Did you really think no one would notice? That you could just walk away with millions in intellectual property and live happily ever after? Tell me, was it worth it? Trading your integrity for a paycheck? Emily's vision blurred with unshed tears. All the sleepless nights she'd spent working overtime, the countless times she'd gone without lunch to save money for her daughter's medications, the pride she'd taken in her work, all of it was being twisted into something ugly and shameful. You're nothing but a desperate woman looking for an easy payday, Hayes declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. A common thief hiding behind the sympathy card of a sick child. It's pathetic, really. Several spectators in the gallery snickered. Emily caught sight of Gerald Whitman's satisfied smirk, saw the way he nodded approvingly at Hayes's performance. Her own lawyer had almost completely given up, merely going through the motions of weak objections that were quickly overruled. Hayes moved closer to Emily's chair, lowering his voice to a near whisper that somehow carried through the silent courtroom. Why don't you just confess? Save us all the time and trouble. Everyone here can see what you are, a desperate, lying fraud who'd do anything for money. Something snapped inside Emily. The months of humiliation, the careful facade of patience she'd maintained while gathering her evidence, the burning anger at watching these powerful men attempt to destroy her life. It all came to a boiling point. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through Hayes's mockery like a knife. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I have one final piece of evidence I'd like to present. Hayes's smirk faltered for just a moment. Your Honor, the defense hasn't filed any additional evidence. I'm allowing it, Judge Michaels interrupted, perhaps sensing something in Emily's demeanor. Ms. Carter, you may proceed. Emily reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the USB drive that contained everything: her salvation, her vindication, and Gerald Whitman's downfall. She had waited for this moment, had endured Hayes's mockery and humiliation just to see the look on their faces when their carefully constructed lies came crashing down. I think, she said, meeting Hayes's gaze with newfound strength. "You'll find this very interesting, Mr. Hayes." The court clerk approached Emily with measured steps, accepting the USB drive from her trembling fingers. The small device seemed to pulse with energy in her hand, a tiny technological sword of justice that would cut through all the lies. As the clerk connected it to the courtroom's computer system, Emily caught a flicker of unease crossing Gerald Whitman's usually composed face. "Your Honor," Hayes interjected, trying to maintain control. "This last-minute evidence is highly irregular. We haven't had time to—" "Quiet, Mr. Hayes," Judge Michaels commanded, his stern gaze fixed on the large screen now flickering to life on the courtroom wall. "Let's see what Ms. Carter has to show us." The video began playing, its timestamp showing 10:47 p.m. on March 14th, the night before Emily's alleged theft of company secrets. The footage showed Gerald Whitman's private office, captured from what appeared to be a hidden security camera in the smoke detector. The image quality was crystal clear, leaving no room for doubt about what was about to unfold. Gerald Whitman entered the frame, followed by Robert Jenkins from IT and Sarah Martinez. The gallery gasped as they recognized the two witnesses who had just testified against Emily. But it was what happened next that caused the real shock waves through the courtroom. "The signature has to be perfect." Whitman's voice came through clearly on the video. "Emily signs all my correspondence. I need this to be indistinguishable from her real signature." The camera captured Sarah practicing Emily's signature repeatedly on a document, while Jenkins worked on a laptop, presumably altering digital records. Whitman stood over them, directing their every move. "The bank statements are ready, sir," Jenkins said in the video. "I backdated the transactions and linked them to the shell account we created. Nobody will be able to trace it back to us." Hayes jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this video is clearly doctored. This is a desperate attempt by the defendant to—" "I'm not finished," Emily interrupted, her voice stronger now. "Keep watching." The video continued, showing Whitman pulling out his phone. The camera picked up his words with perfect clarity. "Vincent? Yes, everything's set. We've got the forged contract, the fake bank statements, and I've got two witnesses who'll say whatever we want. By the time we're done, Emily Carter won't know what hit her." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Michaels banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Emily watched as the color drained from Hayes's face, his earlier smugness replaced by barely concealed panic. But the video wasn't finished. It cut to another scene, timestamped 2 days later, showing Whitman in his office with the witness they'd called from IT. "I've got $5,000 in cash for you," Whitman was saying, handing over an envelope. "Once you testify that you saw her stealing files, there's another $15,000 coming your way. Remember, stick to the story we practiced." The gallery broke into loud whispers. Several jurors were shaking their heads in disgust, while others stared at Gerald Whitman with open contempt. The judge banged his gavel again, harder this time. "Your Honor," Emily's public defender said, finding his voice at last, "we have an expert from the National Digital Forensics Lab standing by to authenticate this footage. He can testify that this video hasn't been altered in any way." Hayes scrambled to salvage what he could. "Your Honor, even if this video is authentic, which we don't concede, it was obtained illegally. Ms. Carter had no right to install recording devices in Mr. Whitman's private office. This is inadmissible." Emily stepped forward. "The camera was installed by Whitman Industries' own security team 3 months ago during a routine upgrade. As executive assistant, I had access to all security footage for archival purposes. Mr. Whitman signed the authorization himself. I have the paperwork right here." She pulled out another document from her folder. The video continued playing, showing more scenes of Whitman and his conspirators plotting against Emily. Each new revelation seemed to sink their case further. They watched as Whitman instructed IT staff on how to alter timestamps on server logs, directed the creation of fake email threads, and coached witnesses on their testimony. "I want her destroyed," Whitman's voice rang out from the video. "She knows too much about our tax evasion schemes. We need to discredit her completely before she figures out what's in those files she's been organizing." Hayes's face had turned ashen. He looked at his client, then back at the video, realizing that his own conversation with Whitman about the frame-up had likely been captured as well. His career was unraveling before his eyes. "Your Honor," Emily said as the video concluded, "I have hours more footage showing Mr. Whitman and Mr. Hayes planning this entire fraudulent case against me. I also have the original, unaltered versions of every document they falsified, with metadata proving their authenticity." Judge Michaels's face had turned stormy. He looked at the USB drive, then at Whitman and Hayes, his expression hardening with each passing second. The courtroom remained silent, the air electric with the impact of what they'd just witnessed. "Court officers," the judge commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "Secure Mr. Whitman and all evidence in this case. Mr. Hayes, I suggest you contact your own attorney immediately." He turned to Emily, his earlier skepticism replaced by barely contained anger at the deception that had played out in his courtroom. "Ms. Carter, I believe you have more evidence to present?" Emily nodded, pulling out another folder. "Yes, Your Honor. Including proof of the tax evasion Mr. Whitman mentioned, which I discovered while organizing his files, the real reason he wanted to destroy my credibility before I could realize what I'd found." As court officers moved toward Whitman, Emily caught Hayes's eye. The arrogant smirk he'd worn throughout the trial had vanished, replaced by the desperate look of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. She allowed herself a small smile, thinking of her daughter waiting at home. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. Vincent Hayes's perfectly manicured world was crumbling around him. Gone was the commanding presence that had dominated the courtroom hours earlier, replaced by a man who couldn't keep his hands from shaking as he shuffled through his papers, desperately searching for a legal escape route. "Your Honor, I move for a brief recess to examine this new evidence and—" "Denied." Judge Michaels cut him off, his voice sharp enough to make Hayes flinch. "Mr. Hayes, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed such a flagrant attempt to perpetrate fraud upon this court." The forensic expert from the National Digital Forensics Lab had arrived, walking briskly to the witness stand. Dr. Alexandra Chin, a renowned expert in video authentication, took less than 20 minutes to confirm what everyone already knew: the video was completely authentic, down to its embedded metadata and digital signatures. The timestamps, video quality, and digital markers all confirm this footage is original and unaltered, Dr. Chin testified, her professional demeanor adding weight to every word. Furthermore, the audio analysis shows no signs of manipulation. "These recordings are genuine." Hayes jumped up again, his Armani tie askew. "Your Honor, even if the video is authentic, my client acted on his own. I had no knowledge of—" "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," Judge Michaels thundered, causing several spectators to jump in their seats. "Or would you like me to play the portion of the video where you explicitly discuss falsifying evidence with Mr. Whitman?" Hayes collapsed back into his chair, the fight draining from his face. Behind him, Gerald Whitman had turned an alarming shade of gray, his previous arrogance replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his empire collapse. "Your Honor," Emily's public defender spoke up, finding new confidence in the turning tide. "We'd like to submit additional evidence of Mr. Hayes's direct involvement in this conspiracy." He held up a thick folder. "These are records of meetings between Mr. Hayes and the witnesses before their testimony, showing how he coached them to lie under oath." Judge Michaels nodded to the bailiff to collect the documents. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone softening as he addressed Emily, "how did you obtain these records?" Emily stood, her posture straight and dignified. "Mr. Whitman's executive assistant replacement wasn't as thorough as I was, Your Honor. She didn't notice when she emailed me Mr. Hayes's entire meeting calendar by mistake. Once I saw the pattern of witness meetings, I knew something wasn't right." The judge turned his attention back to Hayes, who was now frantically whispering with his own hastily summoned attorney. "Mr. Hayes, would you care to explain why you met with Mr. Jenkins 7 times before his testimony, when you claimed in your witness preparation documents that you only met once?" Hayes's new attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client exercises his right to remain silent at this time." "I'm sure he does," Judge Michaels replied dryly. He turned to the court officers. I want every document in this case impounded immediately. Nothing leaves this courtroom. His gaze swept over Hayes and Whitman. And neither do they, until federal agents arrive. The gallery erupted in excited whispers as 2 FBI agents entered the courtroom, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. They'd been waiting in the wings, contacted by Judge Michaels the moment the video evidence surfaced. Vincent Hayes, the lead agent announced. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. He turned to Whitman. Gerald Whitman, you're under arrest for the same charges, plus tax evasion and filing false corporate documents. Hayes seemed to deflate as the agents approached, his carefully cultivated image of legal invincibility shattering completely. This is a mistake, he stammered, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. I was just representing my client's interests. I didn't know. Save it for your own trial, counselor, Judge Michaels interrupted. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in light of this evidence, I am declaring a mistrial due to gross misconduct by the prosecution. Further, I am dismissing all charges against Ms. Carter with prejudice. The judge's gavel crashed down, the sound echoing through the stunned courtroom. But he wasn't finished. Mr. Hayes, I am referring you to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary action. Your conduct in this case goes beyond simple zealous representation into criminal conspiracy. I expect your law license will be suspended pending a full investigation. Hayes slumped in his chair, watching as his professional reputation evaporated. The other attorneys in the gallery were already edging away from him, distancing themselves from his disgrace. As for you, Mr. Whitman, the judge continued, his voice glacial, I'm ordering all of Whitman Industries' financial records frozen pending a full federal investigation. Given what we've heard about tax evasion, I suspect the SEC will be very interested in reviewing your corporate filings. Emily watched as Whitman was handcuffed, the metallic click of the restraints providing a satisfying punctuation to the judge's words. The CEO's face had lost all color, his earlier confidence replaced by the shell-shocked expression of a man watching his life's work dissolve. Court is adjourned, Judge Michaels declared, but then paused. Ms. Carter, please remain. There are federal agents who'd like to speak with you about the tax evasion evidence you uncovered. Your cooperation could be very valuable to their investigation. As the courtroom began to clear, Emily caught a final glimpse of Hayes being led away by federal agents, his designer suit wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something she never expected to see in the arrogant lawyer's face: fear. The judge gathered his papers, then looked directly at Emily. Ms. Carter, I owe you an apology. I allowed myself to be swayed by manufactured evidence and theatrical presentations, when I should have looked deeper. You've done this court, and justice itself, a great service today. Emily nodded, feeling tears of relief threatening to fall. After months of humiliation and stress, after watching her reputation being shredded in this very courtroom, vindication had finally arrived. But more importantly, she had exposed the truth, not just about herself, but about the corruption that had nearly destroyed her life. 6 months after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Emily Carter stood in front of the gleaming glass headquarters of what was once Whitman Industries, now transformed into the epicenter of her own rising business empire. The morning sun reflected off her new designer suit, not borrowed or thrifted this time, but purchased with the proceeds of her massive settlement and successful wrongful termination lawsuit. The headlines in the business section of the morning paper told the story of Gerald Whitman's spectacular fall from grace. Whitman Industries stock plummets 70% amid fraud scandal. Below that, a smaller headline announced, former CEO faces 20 years in federal prison for tax evasion and corporate fraud. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer, not the overwhelmed public defender from the trial, but a top-tier corporate attorney who had helped her navigate the aftermath. The message contained a link to breaking news. Vincent Hayes had just been officially disbarred, his legal career ending in disgrace after a thorough investigation revealed a pattern of ethical violations spanning years. "Mom!" Her daughter Katie called from the car, her voice strong and clear. The latest round of treatments, paid for by the settlement, had worked wonders. "We're going to be late for the board meeting." Emily smiled, remembering how different things had been just months ago. The wrongful termination lawsuit had exposed the full extent of Whitman's corruption, leading to a settlement that exceeded even her lawyer's expectations. But more satisfying than the money was watching Whitman's carefully constructed world crumble around him. His investors had fled en masse after the scandal broke, and the SEC investigation had uncovered years of financial manipulation. The company's stock, once the darling of Wall Street, had plunged into penny stock territory. Major clients canceled contracts, unwilling to be associated with such a toxic brand. Emily had seized the opportunity, using her intimate knowledge of the industry and her settlement money to launch her own technology consulting firm. She hired many of Whitman's former employees, including Sarah Martinez, who had tearfully apologized for her role in the conspiracy and proved to be a valuable asset once freed from Whitman's influence. The last time Emily had seen Gerald Whitman was at his sentencing hearing. The once proud CEO had aged decades in just months, his designer suits replaced by a rumpled court-issued outfit. As he was led away to begin his prison term, he had caught Emily's eye, finally recognizing the strength of the woman he had so gravely underestimated. "Ms. Carter?" Her assistant interrupted her thoughts, hurrying across the lobby. "The venture capital team is waiting in the conference room. They're excited about your new blockchain security protocol." Emily nodded, straightening her shoulders as she walked through the doors of her company, Carter Innovation Technologies. The lobby bore a plaque with her favorite quote: "Never underestimate those you seek to destroy." It served as both a warning and a reminder. The elevator ride to the top floor gave her a moment to reflect on how completely the tables had turned. Her company had just acquired one of Whitman Industries' former subsidiaries at a bankruptcy auction, and industry analysts were predicting Carter Innovation Technologies would exceed Whitman's peak market value within 2 years. The conference room was packed with investors and tech journalists, all eager to hear about her company's latest innovations. As Emily prepared to begin her presentation, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd, Robert Jenkins, the IT worker who had testified against her. He had been relegated to entry-level work after the scandal, his reputation tarnished by his role in Whitman's scheme. "Thank you all for coming," Emily began, her voice confident and clear. "Today, we're not just announcing a new technology. We're introducing a system that will make corporate fraud and data manipulation virtually impossible." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Emily had turned her experience of being framed into inspiration for a revolutionary security system. Pre-orders were already flooding in from companies eager to protect themselves from the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed her. After the presentation, Emily took a moment in her private office, the same office that had once belonged to Gerald Whitman. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a newspaper clipping from the day after the trial. The photos showed Hayes and Whitman being led away in handcuffs, their faces shocked and defeated. Her phone buzzed again, another text, this time from the FBI's Corporate Fraud Division. They wanted to consult with her on strengthening corporate whistleblower protections. She had become something of an expert in the field, turning her traumatic experience into a force for positive change in the business world. Looking out over the city skyline from her office window, Emily thought about how far she had come. The single mother they had dismissed as desperate and powerless now headed a company valued at hundreds of millions. Her daughter was healthy, her future secure, and her reputation not just restored but elevated to heights she had never imagined. The final piece of karma had arrived that morning, a notice that Whitman's appeal had been denied. He would serve his full sentence, giving him plenty of time to reflect on the mistake of underestimating Emily Carter. Hayes, meanwhile, had been reduced to giving cautionary lectures at law schools about ethical violations, his once sterling reputation permanently tarnished. As Emily gathered her materials for her next meeting, her assistant poked her head in. "Ms. Carter? There's a young woman here for the mentorship program, another single mother, recently laid off from her corporate job." Emily smiled, remembering her own journey. "Send her in," she said, straightening the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her and Katie at the opening of the company's new headquarters. I have just the story to share with her about never giving up, no matter how powerful your opponents might seem. The view from the top, she had discovered, was so much sweeter when you had climbed there from rock bottom. As she prepared to meet the young mother, Emily smiled, knowing that her triumph wasn't just personal. It was a beacon of hope for others who might face similar battles against seemingly unbeatable odds.